Hi, this is Daniel from the-digi-picture.com. Some of you might already know me by my night photos I publish frequently on Instagram at my website. This is my first screencast in which we are going to talk about DxO PhotoLab. Then we are going to prepare an HDR bracketing in RAW files for further processing in an HDR software. Let's start with a short introduction to the DxO PhotoLab user interface. The user interface is actually quite simple. There's a big preview area in the middle where you can see your photograph. There's a histogram box. There's a move zoom box, which is particularly useful if you zoomed in, so you don't lose orientation. There's also a metadata box, which shows you the most important EXIF data of your photograph, like ISO value, aperture value, exposure time and focal length. Down here we have a preset editor, which lets you define your own presets and lets DxO PhotoLab apply them to all your newly imported images. Of course, there's also an image browser, which is at the bottom. Image browser lets you select your photographs for processing, and it also comes with a nice feature called virtual copies. We are going to talk about those virtual copies later. For now, I'd like to introduce you to the most important area of the DxO PhotoLab user interface, which is the tool area on the right. The tool area on the right is highly customizable, meaning you can arrange the tools according to your personal workflow. In my case, the workflow usually starts with white balance, exposure compensation, some selective toning, maybe some contrast adjustment, color adjustment, of course noise reduction. There's a curves tool, vignetting correction, further color correction using the HSL tool, sharpening, chromatic aberration correction, a crop tool, distortion correction, and the perspective tool. The perspective tool is actually a plugin you have to purchase separately, but I highly recommend getting it because it's a very easy and efficient way to correct optical distortions like converging vertical lines. Last but not least, I'd like to talk about lens profiles. DxO PhotoLab is famous for its scientifically created lens profiles. The DxO lab creates those profiles for almost any lens out there, and if there is a profile for your lens, all the optical corrections like chromatic aberration correction, lens distortion correction, vignetting correction are done automatically by the system. The only time you have to do that manually is if for your lens there's no profile, or if you use a manual lens which does not write EXIF data into the file itself. Let's take a look at what we're working with. What we've got here is an exposure bracketing consisting of 6 different exposures. Each exposure is one stop apart from the other. The exposures range from 1/4 of a second up to 8 seconds. The image itself shows the view from a bridge in Bern, Switzerland, and we are going to process this exposure bracketing and create a beautiful HDR image. Alright, let's start the process. The first step is going to be creating virtual copies. The name virtual copies is actually a bit confusing in my opinion, because these aren't really copies, these are more like versions of the same photograph. So we are selecting the 6 exposures, we are right clicking and we are selecting create virtual copy, and now we have 6 versions, 6 new versions of our 6 exposures, and Even though I look at them as versions, I'm going to stick with the term virtual copies. That is preferred by DxO, so to avoid any confusion, I stick with virtual copies. Next up is the white balance. I've already determined the value that looks best to me in preparation for this tutorial, so I am entering a value of 2500 degree Kelvin and a value of 20 on the green magenta axis. With white shots and white balance, there isn't really a correct setting. There's only the setting that looks closest to what the scene looked like to you when you were at the scene. This setting, in this case, matches what I remember of the scene, what it looked like, so I'm going with these values, but of course you could also try different values and give it a slightly warmer or colder touch. The next thing I'm going to change is color vibrancy. I am setting a value of 10, and the reason why I prefer vibrancy over saturation is that vibrancy leaves the already saturated areas alone and only touches the less saturated areas. It results in a more subtle effect compared to saturation, but you could also work with the saturation slider, or another option would be to leave colors alone at this stage and deal with them later on in the HDR software or even in the image editor. What is needed now is some noise reduction. Because I used an ISO value of 400 for this photograph, there is some noise best visible in the sky, and DxO PhotoLab offers a really good noise reduction. So we set it to 50. I increase low frequency to 85 and dead pixel to 45. These values are based on my personal experience. For example, I know that my camera tends to introduce dead pixels. You can see one right here. And now if we zoom in, the noise reduction kicks in and the dead pixel is gone. I'm not applying too much noise reduction right now, because if it's not sufficient, we can always do some more noise reduction in the HDR software or even at the end in the image editor. For now, that's good enough. Now it's time for the optical corrections. We have Vignetting Correction, which is based on the DxO lens profile for this lens, and the vignetting correction is really precise and you can leave it on auto in most cases. Another correction is chromatic aberration correction, but in this image chromatic aberration isn't a huge subject, so we can leave that on auto too and proceed to lens distortion. Lens distortion is also something that is based on a lens profile, but what I want to do right now is check this box for keep aspect ratio so that the slight correction of the lens distortion does not alter the aspect ratio, because I want the aspect ratio to be the same as in the original image. The last step is perspective correction with the DxO Viewpoint plugin. You can see now that this is a really simple process. If you click on the tool, you get to two lines which you can use to mark vertical lines that aren't straight. In this case we have the right side, which is already alright, but to make sure we mark a vertical line here, and on the opposite side, on the left side of the image, there's a bit of distortion, some converging vertical lines. You can see this if I place the line here. Now you can see that the line isn't 100% straight. It is almost straight, but not completely. We click on apply, and now the image is straightened. And if we check this by enabling grid overlay, we can see that all those lines are now straight. Yes, worked perfectly. Alright, let's switch grid overlay off again, and the final step is I use the crop tool to determine the composition. I use the rules of thirds for the church and the horizon. I place the horizon around here, check the edges. Oh, we lost some resolution over here, so we have to reduce the canvas a bit to match our image. Now we have cut off a bit of the church. We can widen the area a bit. We can move it a bit up. All right, like this. Yeah, I like it like this. Let's click on close. Final check. Looks good. And now we can copy these settings over to the rest of our exposures. Right click on the virtual copy, copy correction settings, select all the other virtual copies, right click, paste correction settings. Okay, now the settings are now applied to all the other images. We can quickly check. Composition is always the same. The only difference, of course, is the exposure. Looks good. Now we can select all our virtual copies, right click on one and select export to disk. I am going to export them as 16-bit TIFF files. I am going to leave the ICC profile alone, which is Adobe RGB right now. Later on I'm going to change it to sRGB, but for now it stays in Adobe RGB. Of course I have to select the destination folder, which I've already prepared, and we can click on export. And thanks to some post-processing magic, you didn't even have to wait for the export to finish. Now our 16-bit TIFF files are in the corresponding folder and ready to be processed by an HDR software. In our case, this is going to be Aurora HDR 2018. But this is going to take place in another tutorial. This concludes today's tutorial. I hope you liked it. If you liked it, subscribe to this channel or visit my website or hit my Instagram account at the-digi-picture.com. Thanks for watching and goodbye.